So I continue with my paper on anger and its implications for ethical leadership in organizations. In Thurman's view, contemporary society is resigned to anger. Although in both Christianity and Eastern thought, anger was seen as deadly to the soul, people today do not necessarily believe in the soul, and so anger in our secular society is no longer seen as a great problem, albeit viewed as a negative emotion, which is bad for our health and relationships, more condoned in males than females. Furthermore, contemporary secular society neither meets nor challenges anger, and in fact condones the notion of righteous anger, for example, against injustice or criminality, and its accepted outcomes such as severe prison laws, capital punishment, and so on. It also condones the right of contemporary women to anger, as protest at previous male domination. To illustrate resignation from anger from a Western perspective, Thurman reminds us of Seneca's essay on anger. Seneca, who lived from 3 BC to 65 AD, viewed anger as unnatural to humans, uncontrolled, very destructive, and likened it to temporary insanity. According to Seneca, anger is acted out in various ways, including murders, arson, devastation, killing, and backstabbing. Anger cannot be used as a tool of reason, and even in the case of so-called righteous anger, aimed at righting an injury to oneself or one's family, is neither right nor reliable. Those issues which generate righteous anger are better dealt with by means of the virtues like courage, justice, endurance, and wisdom, which do not need assistance from anger. Anger must be seen as bad and must be conquered. Seneca's views accords with the Stoics, and he does not agree with Aristotle that anger can be appropriate. An Eastern perspective on resigning from anger is that of Buddhism, which according to Thurman links anger to self-delusion. Anger leads to 4 further addictions, namely aggression, meaning assault on another, vindictiveness, meaning revenge on one's enemy, malice, meaning hurtful speech, and violence, meaning an overall desire to harm others. To resign from anger means to first acknowledge that anger is our greatest enemy. It is bad, negative, always harmful, and destructive. Then one must decide to get rid of it. Patience, particularly with the injury done to us, is seen as the antidote to the destructiveness of anger. Dealing with potential anger at an early stage and refusing to be distracted from happiness by anger is also advocated. In fact, in Buddhism, patience has more than one stage and moves through endurance, to active forbearance based on insight, to forgiving patience, and finally to resignation from anger. A third step in gaining a greater understanding of the anatomy of anger is to engage with some of the thoughts and ideas of the great philosophers and theologians on this issue. The ancient philosophers, from Plato to Plutarch, viewed all vices, including anger, as defects, which could be overcome by education and discipline. While virtuous people led orderly, rational lives, those controlled by vices were irrational, impulsive, anxious, and discontented. The Stoic philosophers believed that anger was both immoderate and a sickness, and that all emotions were excluded from the wise and virtuous person, while Aristotle believed anger and other emotions were moderated by reason in the virtuous. Both Aristotle and Plutarch extolled character development to counteract vice. Considering Aristotle's views in a little more detail, we find that he believed that feelings and emotions in themselves were neither virtues nor vices, but that they could affect us detrimentally if we had either too much or too little of the particular feeling. For Aristotle, anger was an emotion directed at someone in particular and aimed at gaining pleasurable revenge for an injury. In other words, anger was a reaction to some injury, and in fact was provoked by this perceived injury. Excessive anger was equivalent to irascibility, with angry people being distressed and taking pleasure in retaliating. Excessive anger is indicated when one is angry with those whom one ought not to be angry with, for too long, in circumstances where one ought not to be angry, and where the anger is out of proportion to the event. Aristotle believed those who demonstrated excessive anger were of 3 types. Irascible people, that is, those who become angry inappropriately fast, but also cooled down fast and retaliate rather than clinging to their anger. Hypercholeric people, that is, those with very quick tempers who get angry quickly about anything, anytime. And bitter people, that is, those who remain angry for a long time despite the fact that they control their tempers. These difficult people really only let go of anger after retaliating, as this gives pleasure. However, if they do not or cannot pay back and relieve their pain, the anger lasts and no one can persuade them to let it go. Such anger does harm to themselves and to those near to them. To have too little anger amounted to spiritlessness, and in Western culture would be the equivalent of not showing so-called righteous anger, whether on behalf of self or others, for example by putting up with abuse of either self or others. For Aristotle, this would be slavish behavior. The balanced state of so-called mildness meant a person was mild-tempered. Mild anger was appropriate anger, neither overwhelming nor seeking revenge. Aristotle observed that all extremes of anger would always attract censure, but that it was difficult to understand why some types of anger attracted more censure than others. For example, manly anger was less censured. We have already made mention of Seneca and his view that anger can never be appropriate and should be eliminated. However, not everyone has agreed with this so-called overly optimistic view of some pagan philosophers that humans could control vice and develop a virtuous character. St. Augustine was one of these, and felt that such virtue could only occur with God's grace, as persons are both weak and corrupt, and cannot attain total perfection in this world. Let us turn now to the thoughts of Aquinas on anger. Like Aristotle and also influenced by him, Thomas Aquinas examined anger in some detail. According to the contemporary philosopher Herbert McCabe, Aquinas was very interested in anger, which he saw as the emotion or passion most involved with the rational assessment of the world. Aquinas held that all passions belonged to the sensitive appetite, which could be divided into two parts, the concupiscible and the irascible appetites. The passions of the concupiscible appetite included love, hate, desire, flight, delight, and sorrow, and were aroused as a result of seeing something we view as good or bad. Those of the irascible appetite are aroused by things we see and view as good or bad, but that we have difficulty acquiring or avoiding. They include hope, despair, daring, fear, and anger. Aquinas believed that all emotions were God-given, that the good life is a passionate life, and that emotion should be guided by virtues rather than suppressed. Like Aristotle, he argued that passions or emotions are not morally good or bad in themselves, but according to their relation with the will and need to be controlled. Uncontrolled emotion is problematic. For Aquinas, anger was contrary to gentleness and was a desire for the pleasure of revenge, and in that sense a matter of the appetites of desire, but excited by failure to ward off an evil, and thus a matter for the aggressive appetites. Anger is motivated by injury to the angry person, without which Aquinas believed no person would be angry. The root cause of anger is really another's contempt for us, and it aims to punish those who have offended us. Anger's effects include compromising our judgment, being pleased at the punishment of the guilty, and physical reactions such as flushing and increased heart rate. For Aquinas, anger was the most reasonable of the emotions, given that it could motivate the person to take action for a reason, that is, as a result of injury suffered. It is also an emotion needed by humans in order to be courageous and to defend justice. For Aquinas, anger bred from a zeal for justice and aimed at righting injustice was not sinful, because this is anger at sin. However, such anger must be governed by reason, and the vengeance taken must be legal and in proportion to the injustice. Aquinas gives a nuanced account of anger and sin, carefully outlining how anger could be a mortal sin and how it could be a capital sin. Unrighteous anger is not governed by reason and is seriously sinful. Such anger harms another seriously, is contrary to the demands of justice, and seeks vengeance for vengeance's own sake. A capital sin is one which can cause many other sins. This is true in the case of anger. Aquinas refers to Gregory the Great's list of the so-called daughters of anger, namely quarrels, inflated ego, insults, exclamations, indignation, blasphemies. What this means is that anger can result in our committing other sins such as blaspheming against God, ranting against our neighbor, insulting others, and so on.